You know how some moments stick to your skin like a scar? That's how Maria Alvarez remembered the first morning she walked into the Reynolds penthouse in Dallas. She wasn't there more than 2 minutes before she was reminded of exactly where she stood in their world, at the very bottom. Maria had grown up on the border in El Paso, daughter of a mechanic and a seamstress. Her English carried a soft Spanish lilt. Her coat was secondhand, and her shoes had seen better days. But what really set her apart was something you couldn't see: the quiet promise she'd made to herself to never let her family sink after her father died. That promise carried her here, even if it meant working as a live-in maid for a family that saw people like her as invisible. The elevator doors opened to marble floors polished to a mirror shine. A chandelier hung overhead like a crown, cold and glittering. Maria clutched her tote strap tighter, whispering the words she always told herself before stepping into the unknown. Fuerza, mija, strength. Her father used to say that when she fell off her bike, when she brought home grades lower than she wanted, when the rent notice appeared on their door. Strength, always strength. But strength felt far away when Catherine Reynolds appeared at the top of the stairs. Tall, dressed in cream silk, diamonds winking in her ears, she looked Maria up and down like she was a stain on the carpet. "So," she said flatly, "you're the girl Mrs. Ruth recommended. Not Maria, not Miss Alvarez, just the girl." Maria nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am, Maria Alvarez. Thank you for giving me this chance." Catherine's lips curved, but it wasn't a smile. "We'll see if you last longer than the others. My son doesn't tolerate mistakes." Her eyes lingered on Maria's coat, the frayed threads at the sleeve, before she turned sharply on her heel. That's when Maria first saw him, Ethan Reynolds, broad-shouldered, immaculately dressed, jaw tight like stone. He didn't shake her hand, didn't even say welcome. He just looked her over, cold gray eyes narrowing, and muttered, "As long as you do your job and don't complicate things, we'll have no problem." His tone wasn't angry. It was worse. It was dismissive, like she wasn't even worth raising his voice over. Maria swallowed the lump rising in her throat. She told herself not to react, not to show a crack. That was the first lesson you learned growing up brown and broke in Texas. People already expected you to break. Prove them wrong by standing tall, even if your knees shook. But the hardest blow didn't come from Ethan or Catherine. It came from the little girl sitting silent in the corner of the living room, Lily Reynolds. Blonde hair falling into her pale face, tiny fingers clutching a stuffed rabbit worn at the ears. She didn't even glance up when Maria entered. No hello, no curiosity, no sound. Just silence, thick and suffocating. "Don't waste your time," Ethan said quietly, catching Maria watching. "She hasn't spoken in a year, and she won't for you." The words cut sharper than Catherine's diamonds. Not just the dismissal of Lily's pain, but the certainty in his tone that Maria, a poor Latina maid, couldn't possibly matter enough to change anything here. Maria nodded once, swallowing her response. She wanted to tell him that kids don't stay silent forever, that sometimes all it takes is someone willing to listen. But she bit her tongue. She had no power here, no room for mistakes. All she could do was keep her head down, do the work, and hold on to that promise she'd made her family, to endure. What Maria didn't know yet was that this silence, Lily's silence, Ethan's coldness, Catherine's disdain, wasn't the end of her story. It was the beginning. And one day, all of them would regret underestimating the girl from El Paso.
The first weeks in the Reynolds penthouse tested Maria more than any job she'd ever worked. Every morning before sunrise, she slipped out of the small servants' room topped at the end of the hall and padded through the mansion's quiet corridors. Her chores were endless, polishing silver that gleamed brighter than her future seemed, scrubbing floors you could already see your reflection in, ironing designer suits that cost more than her mother's yearly rent back in El Paso. No matter how hard she worked, Ethan always found something to criticize. "You missed a spot. The towels aren't folded evenly. Don't touch the piano again." His voice was never loud, but each word was like a verdict, cold and cutting. Maria learned to swallow the sting, bow her head slightly, and say nothing. To answer back would mean losing her job, and losing her job meant her brother back home wouldn't afford textbooks next semester. At night, when the house quieted, Maria would sit by the window of her little room and whisper to herself, "Aguanta, mija. Hold on." She thought of her father's hands, oil-stained from long days fixing cars, and of her mother bent over a sewing machine, eyes tired but hopeful. They hadn't raised her to quit. But if Ethan's criticism weighed heavy, Lily's silence was heavier still. The little girl lived in a world walled off by grief. Maria tried soft approaches, placing fresh flowers by her bedside, leaving crayons on her table, humming lullabies in Spanish while folding laundry nearby. Lily never reacted. She just sat by the window, clutching her rabbit, staring at nothing. One rainy afternoon, Maria sat in the corner of Lily's room while dusting the shelves. Instead of leaving quickly as usual, she quietly pulled out a small sketchbook from her apron pocket. She began to draw, a simple outline of the Virgen de Guadalupe, something her abuela had taught her when she was a girl. Her pencil scratched softly against the page. After a while, she noticed Lily's eyes flicker toward her, just for a second, but enough to make Maria's breath hitch. Maria didn't comment, didn't move closer. She just kept sketching, letting the sound of pencil on paper fill the silence. The next day, she left the drawing on Lily's desk and said nothing. Later, when she returned, she found a faint crayon mark added in the corner, clumsy, uneven, but undeniably Lily's. It was the smallest crack in the wall, but Maria held on to it like a miracle. Still, Ethan didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't want to. That evening, when Maria served dinner, he frowned at the way she placed the plates. "Don't act like you're part of this family," he muttered under his breath, just loud enough for her to hear. "You're here to work, nothing more." Maria's chest burned, but she steadied her hands. She reminded herself that silence wasn't weakness. Sometimes silence was strength, the strength to endure long enough to change something. And deep inside, Maria believed one thing. Lily's silence wouldn't last forever. When it broke, the sound would be powerful enough to shake the walls Ethan had built around himself and maybe even the entire Reynolds household. For now, Maria kept her head down, her heart steady, and her hope alive, because one day the girl everyone overlooked would prove that no cage of wealth or prejudice could keep her from shining.
It happened on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of gray New York day when the clouds pressed so low it felt like the city had forgotten how to breathe. Ethan had been pacing the living room, phone in hand, barking orders at some contractor about a delayed shipment for his latest project. His voice carried sharp and impatient, the kind that made Maria flinch even when the words weren't aimed at her. Lily sat curled in her usual spot by the window, rabbit pressed tight against her chest. Maria was dusting the bookshelves, quietly, keeping out of Ethan's way, when he suddenly snapped the phone shut and turned toward his daughter. "Enough of this silence, Lily," he said, his tone harsher than usual. "You can't keep sitting there like some broken doll. If you want to live in this house, you'll start acting normal." The words hung in the air like a slap. Maria froze, cloth still in her hand. Lily's small shoulders tensed, her lips pressing into a trembling line. Something inside Maria cracked. Before she could stop herself, she stepped forward. "Mr. Reynolds, please." Ethan's head whipped toward her, eyes narrowing like a hawk spotting prey. "What did you say?" Maria's pulse thundered. Her instinct screamed to step back, apologize, retreat into silence as she always had. But not this time. Not with Lily shrinking smaller by the second. "I said, please don't speak to her like that," Maria repeated, voice steady, though her hands shook. "She's a child. She's grieving. She needs patience, not pressure." For a moment, Ethan simply stared at her, stunned that his maid dared to challenge him. Then his face hardened. "You think you know better than me how to raise my daughter? He gestured at her with a sharp flick of his hand, his voice dripping with disdain.
You are just the help. Don't forget your place." The humiliation burned like fire under Maria's skin. She should have lowered her gaze. She should have swallowed her pride. But instead, she took a breath, and in a voice that carried more strength than she knew she had, she said, "My place, Mr. Reynolds, is standing up for what's right. And if that means reminding you that your daughter needs love more than control, then yes, that's my place." The room fell silent. Even the city noise outside seemed to pause. Ethan's lips parted, but no words came. His hand dropped to his side, useless. He had expected obedience, maybe fear, but not defiance, not truth spoken with such quiet conviction. And then it happened. A soft sound broke through the silence. Lily's voice, fragile, halting, but clear. "Don't yell." Both adults turned, stunned. Lily had spoken for over a year. Her rabbit slipped from her arms, landing on the rug. She looked at her father with watery eyes, then at Maria, and whispered again, "Don't yell." Ethan staggered back a step as though struck. His face drained of color. For the first time, his authority meant nothing. Maria knelt beside Lily, her voice trembling, but warm. "It's okay, mija. You're safe." In that single moment, the balance of power in the Reynolds home shifted forever. The maid Ethan had dismissed as invisible had just unlocked the voice of his silent daughter, something no doctor, no therapist, not even Ethan himself had managed to do. And Ethan knew it.
The room stayed frozen long after Lily's small, trembling voice broke through the silence. Ethan, who had built his entire world around routines and rules, now stood pale and wordless, his eyes fixed on the little girl he thought he knew so well. For months, he had convinced himself she was unreachable, that her silence was permanent, something only specialists and money could solve. But here she was, whispering her very first word, not to him, but to Maria, the housekeeper he had barely tolerated. The ripple effect was instant. Lily reached for Maria's hand, clutching it with desperate trust. It was a gesture so natural, so childlike, that it stripped Ethan of every excuse he had built to explain her condition. His throat tightened, not from anger, but from a crushing wave of guilt. He remembered all the times he dismissed Maria, silenced her attempts to comfort Lily, even scolded her for interfering. Now he realized what Maria had been doing all along. She wasn't breaking his rules. She was breaking through the walls he had built. Maria, meanwhile, sat quietly beside Lily, her free hand gently smoothing the girl's hair. She didn't smile triumphantly, didn't gloat. Instead, she whispered encouragement, her voice steady, calm, maternal. In her eyes, there was no trace of resentment toward Ethan, only the quiet conviction of someone who knew love was stronger than control. That restraint, that humility cut deeper than any harsh word could have. From the doorway, Mrs. Ramirez, Ethan's mother, watched with her lips pressed tight. She had always sensed Maria's quiet strength, but had allowed Ethan to enforce his rules unchecked. Now she saw what true care looked like. Soft, patient, and without pride. A faint look of regret clouded her face. Later that evening, Ethan retreated to his study, the sound of Lily's tiny voice echoing in his mind like a song he couldn't escape. He poured himself a drink, but left it untouched, staring instead at a family photo on his desk. Lily as a baby in her mother's arms. The memory of his late wife's laughter hit him like a storm. She had always said, "Ethan, love isn't control. Love is presence." For the first time,
he admitted to himself that Maria had embodied those words better than he ever had. The next morning, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Ethan didn't bark orders or critique Maria's work. Instead, he stood awkwardly in the kitchen doorway as Maria prepared breakfast. "Thank you," he muttered, his voice barely audible. Maria looked up, surprised. For a moment, she considered brushing it off, but something in his eyes told her the words were sincere. She nodded gently and went back to her task. For Lily, the change was palpable. She began to hum softly while Maria worked, her tiny voice like a fragile thread weaving hope through the cold halls of the house. And though Ethan still wrestled with his pride, each sound reminded him that healing had entered his home, not through control, but through the courage of a woman he had once underestimated.
Weeks passed, and the house no longer felt like a museum. Where silence once pressed against the walls, laughter now slipped through doorways. Lily began speaking more, short words at first, then stringing them into sentences, always with Maria close by. She still clutched her stuffed rabbit for comfort, but now she shared it willingly, placing it on Maria's lap or even handing it to Ethan with shy trust. For Ethan, each of these small milestones was both a gift and a reckoning. Every smile Lily gave Maria reminded him of the years he had wasted hiding behind rules and walls. Guilt gnawed at him, but instead of doubling down on pride, he slowly chose humility. He started to ask Maria for guidance. How do you get her to open up? What story calms her at night? His voice carried none of the arrogance it once did, just the halting tone of a father learning how to love again. Maria never lectured him. She didn't need to. Her example spoke louder than words. The way she listened when Lily struggled to form a sentence, the way she gave the child space when she recoiled, the way she celebrated the smallest step forward with genuine joy, those were lessons Ethan absorbed day by day. The turning point came one Saturday afternoon when Lily spilled her juice across the table. In the past, Ethan's sharp voice would have cracked like a whip, but this time he froze, glanced at Maria, then knelt down himself. "It's okay, mija," he said softly, using a word he had overheard Maria whisper to Lily. "We'll clean it together." The astonishment in Lily's eyes was almost too much to bear. She nodded, then whispered, "Okay, Daddy." The word, Daddy, broke something inside Ethan, and tears filled his eyes before he could stop them. For the first time in years, he allowed himself to weep openly, not from grief, but from the overwhelming relief of being let back into his daughter's world. From that moment, everything changed. Ethan and Maria no longer moved in separate orbits, but worked as partners in Lily's healing. Meals became a shared ritual, filled with small talk and warm smiles. Story time was no longer restricted to rigid books. Maria introduced Spanish lullabies her mother had once sung to her, and Ethan, awkward at first, began humming along. Lily, nestled between them, would giggle at their off-key attempts, her laughter filling the house like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The lesson was clear, though painful. Love cannot grow where there is only fear. Ethan had learned that control was not protection, that walls don't keep pain out, they lock it in. Maria's resilience had reminded him of something his wealth and rules had never provided: compassion, patience, and the courage to be vulnerable. For Maria, the journey proved something too. She had walked into that mansion as a struggling housekeeper, doubted, dismissed, and treated as insignificant. But by staying true to her heart, she had not only saved a child, but also helped heal a broken father. She had shown that dignity and strength are not measured by status or background, but by the capacity to give love without conditions. In the end, this story wasn't just about a little girl finding her voice. It was about what happens when people dare to step beyond prejudice, when they choose compassion over pride, and when they let go of fear long enough to embrace hope. And maybe that's the message for us all. No matter how high the walls, no matter how deep the silence, the human spirit can break through if we're brave enough to listen, love, and believe again.
Life inside the Blake home began to shift, but healing was never a straight line. For every moment of laughter, there were setbacks, sudden storms that reminded Maria how fragile progress could be. One late evening, while she was folding laundry in the quiet maid's quarters, Maria heard a sharp voice echo down the hall. Ethan had found Lily hiding under the dining table, refusing to eat the carefully plated meal he'd insisted upon. His patience, thin as glass, finally snapped. "Why can't you just try?" His words rang out, clipped and harsh, echoing against the marble floor. Maria rushed in, heart pounding. Lily's little body shook as she pressed her bunny to her chest, eyes wide in fear. The sight stabbed Maria in a way she couldn't ignore. She gently crouched beside Lily, her voice soft, almost like a lullaby. "It's okay, mi amor. You don't have to if you're not ready." Then she turned to Ethan, steady and unflinching. "You can't force her through fear. That's not how healing works." Ethan froze, torn between his pride and the truth staring back at him. His jaw tightened, but behind his steely eyes was exhaustion, years of holding grief like armor. For the first time, Maria didn't look away. She saw him not as the millionaire, not as the intimidating master of the house, but as a broken father terrified of losing the last piece of his wife. The room went still. Then, as if deflating, Ethan let out a long, shaky breath and muttered, "I don't know how to do this anymore." His voice cracked. It wasn't anger, it was surrender. That night, Maria sat across from him at the long oak dining table. No chandeliers, no staff, no polished manners, just two weary souls. She shared stories of her own father, who had worked 2 jobs and still found time to listen when she was scared. She spoke of her mother, who sang boleros on nights when the power went out, teaching her that comfort wasn't about fixing everything, it was about being there. Ethan listened in silence. He didn't argue, didn't interrupt. The man who once barked orders now seemed almost childlike, hungry for a wisdom he had never allowed himself to need. Over the next few days, the cracks in his ice became clearer. He lingered more often near the playroom, pretending to read financial reports, but really watching Maria and Lily from the corner of his eye. He no longer snapped at spilled juice or misplaced toys. Instead, he caught himself, swallowed the reflex, and stayed quiet. Maria noticed. She didn't praise him outright, but she acknowledged his effort with the smallest nods, the kind that spoke volumes. And Lily noticed too. For the first time, she dared to inch closer to her father during bedtime stories, her tiny hand brushing against his sleeve. Ethan's breath hitched at the contact. He looked at Maria as if seeking permission, and she gave him a small, reassuring smile. Slowly, he rested his hand over Lily's, not pressing, just being there. The little girl didn't pull away. In that quiet, fragile moment, Ethan Blake realized something he had fought for years. Control wasn't strength. Letting go was.
The house had grown quieter in recent days, not the suffocating silence of before, but a cautious calm, like the pause before a storm. Maria sensed something was building, though she couldn't tell whether it would break them or heal them. One rainy Saturday, the truth revealed itself. Thunder rolled outside as Lily sat on the rug with her crayons, sketching wobbly shapes. Maria hummed softly while folding laundry nearby. Ethan was pacing, restless, his tie loosened, as though the storm outside had seeped into his chest. Then it happened. Lily reached for a crayon, her small hand trembling, and whispered her first word since Maria had arrived. It was barely audible, just a breath of sound, but Maria heard it. "Mama." The crayon snapped in her hand as she froze. Ethan's head whipped around, his eyes wide, disbelief etched across his face. Maria's heart swelled, tears pricking her eyes, but she stayed still, not wanting to startle the fragile moment. Lily repeated it again, this time louder. "Mama." She clutched her bunny and glanced toward Maria. Ethan's face contorted, shock, then relief, then something raw. Jealousy. His hands balled into fists, as if holding on to invisible chains. The word had pierced him like a blade. His daughter's first utterance in months wasn't for him, it was for the maid. The tension in the room snapped. Ethan stormed forward, voice booming. "She's my daughter! You don't get to take that from me!" His anger ricocheted through the penthouse, rattling Lily back into silence. Maria stood her ground, trembling but unyielding. "I didn't take anything, Ethan. She called out because she feels safe. Isn't that what you want, for her to feel safe again?" His chest heaved. The storm inside him clashed with the storm outside, lightning flashing across his pale face. He looked down at Lily, her tiny frame hunched, shoulders trembling, eyes wide with the terror Maria had seen too many times. For the first time, Ethan seemed to really see it, the terror he had become in his daughter's eyes. The realization broke him. His fury drained, replaced by something far more devastating: shame. He stumbled back, pressing his hand against the wall, his breath ragged. His lips quivered as he whispered, "I thought I was protecting her, but I've been the prison." The silence afterward was heavier than the thunder outside. Maria knelt, wrapping her arms gently around Lily, who clung to her with desperate trust. She whispered, "It's okay, baby. You're safe." Then she looked up at Ethan, not with scorn, but with quiet defiance. "This is your moment, Ethan. You can choose to stay the warden or become her father again." Ethan's knees buckled. He slid into the armchair, covering his face with both hands. For the first time in years, tears spilled freely. He didn't fight them. He didn't hide. Lily, still nestled in Maria's arms, peeked up at her father, her bunny pressed tight against her chest. She whispered again, softer this time, "Daddy." And in that fragile word, the storm inside the Blake home finally began to break.
The morning after Lily's whispered, "Daddy," the penthouse felt different. The air wasn't heavy in the same way. It carried a fragile quiet, the kind that comes when a wound has been cut open and is finally beginning to breathe. Ethan didn't leave for the office that day. Instead, he sat at the breakfast table in silence, staring at his coffee, his hands trembling slightly. The man who once carried himself with unshakable control now looked smaller. Mrs. Ramirez noticed, her sharp eyes softening. She set a plate before him and muttered, "Guilt's a heavy meal, Mr. Blake. Best to chew it slowly." Maria almost smiled at the remark, but she knew this wasn't a moment for jokes. She moved carefully around the kitchen, giving Ethan space, though she could feel his gaze following her, no longer with suspicion, but with something unsettled, almost searching. Later that afternoon, Ethan knocked on the door to the playroom, an act so simple,
yet so rare it startled Maria. He entered slowly, as if afraid his presence might shatter the fragile progress Lily had made. He crouched near the little girl who was coloring with Maria. His voice cracked as he spoke. "Can I join you?" Lily hesitated, clutching her bunny tighter, her eyes flicking between Maria and her father. Maria gave her a reassuring nod, then slid aside to make space. Ethan picked up a crayon, blue, and began awkwardly scribbling a crooked star on the page. His hand shook, but his eyes softened when Lily shyly extended a yellow crayon toward him. For the first time, there was no command, no rule, just the father trying to relearn how to be present. That night, Ethan called Maria into his study. He looked exhausted, but not from anger. This was the fatigue of a man stripped of his armor. "I owe you an apology," he began, his voice hoarse. "I've treated you like an intruder when you've been the only one brave enough to stay by her side. I thought control was strength, but I see now it was fear, and I've made Lily carry the weight of it." Maria stayed quiet, letting the words hang in the air. She'd never imagined Ethan Blake, powerful, commanding Ethan, would confess such vulnerability. After a long pause, she said gently, "You can't change what's already been done, but you can choose what happens next. Lily doesn't need a perfect father, just a present one." Ethan bowed his head, his jaw tight. "I don't know if I know how." Maria met his gaze, steady and unflinching. "Then let her teach you." From that day on, the rhythm of the household shifted. Ethan still carried the scars of his old ways, slipping into commands now and then, but Maria's quiet strength became an anchor. Mrs. Ramirez, once skeptical, began to look at Maria with genuine respect. "You've done more for this house than all the money in his bank account," she whispered one evening while drying dishes. And Lily, once a shadow in her own home, began to laugh more. Not every day, not without setbacks, but enough to remind everyone that healing was possible. For Maria, this was more than a job now. It was a mission. Not just to keep the household running, but to redefine what family could mean in a house that had forgotten. The days that followed felt like a cautious rebirth inside the Blake penthouse. The marble floors, once echoing only with silence and reprimands, now carried softer sounds, small footsteps, the shuffle of crayons, the occasional burst of a child's laughter that seemed to startle even the walls. Maria noticed it first. Each morning, Ethan lingered a little longer at the breakfast table instead of rushing out the door. He'd ask Lily how she slept, fumbling through the words like a student learning a new language. At first, Lily only stared, clutching her bunny close. But one morning, she whispered, "Fine," and Ethan nearly dropped his coffee cup. Maria smiled at the exchange, though she said nothing. She knew trust couldn't be demanded, it had to be earned, moment by fragile moment. One Saturday afternoon, Maria suggested something bold. "Let's take Lily to the park," she said while tidying the living room. Ethan stiffened immediately. She doesn't do well outside." His voice carried the familiar edge of fear. "Then let her see the world again," Maria replied gently. "Even if it's just 5 minutes. Sometimes a change of air is what the soul needs." Ethan hesitated, his jaw clenched, but finally nodded. At the park, the crisp autumn air carried the smell of roasted peanuts from a vendor nearby. Children ran across the grass, their laughter sharp against the city's hum. Lily froze at first, gripping Maria's hand so tightly it hurt. Ethan hovered protectively, his eyes scanning the crowd like a soldier bracing for battle. But then Maria knelt beside Lily, pointing to a pair of sparrows hopping near the fountain. "Look, they're racing each other," she whispered. Lily's eyes followed, wide with curiosity.
Slowly, she released Maria's hand and inched closer to the birds. When they fluttered away, Lily let out a small giggle, a sound so pure Ethan's eyes welled with tears. That night, Ethan stood in the doorway of Maria's small room, hesitant. "I need to thank you," he said, his voice low. "Not just for today. For every day you've stayed when most people would have walked out." Maria folded her hands in her lap. "I didn't stay because it was easy, Mr. Blake. I stayed because Lily deserves someone who won't give up on her. And because I know what it feels like to be left behind." Their eyes met, and for the first time Ethan didn't look away. Something softened between them, a fragile recognition that both carried wounds, though from different worlds. As weeks passed, Lily's progress grew. She spoke in short phrases, asked timid questions, and even began standing for a few seconds without clinging to furniture. Each milestone was celebrated quietly, with Maria's gentle encouragement and Ethan's cautious pride. Mrs. Ramirez, once the sharp observer, became their quiet ally. One evening she muttered, "This house doesn't feel like a museum anymore. Feels like a home." Maria tucked Lily into bed that night, her small voice murmuring, "Good night, Mommy." The word caught Maria off guard, tears stinging her eyes. Ethan, watching from the doorway, placed a hand over his chest, as if steadying a heart that hadn't beaten freely in years. For the first time, all three of them realized the foundation of a new family was being laid, one built not on wealth or control, but on patience, forgiveness, and the fragile courage to begin again.
Winter melted into spring, and the Blake penthouse no longer resembled the cold fortress Maria first walked into. Bright drawings lined the refrigerator door, stuffed animals sat scattered across the velvet rug, and laughter, real unrestrained laughter, floated through the halls where silence had once reigned. Maria often found herself pausing just to take it in. Lily, who had once sat curled and silent, now toddled across the living room, arms outstretched, calling for her father or for Maria. Ethan, who once barked orders like a general, now crouched on the floor, letting Lily climb onto his shoulders while he made clumsy horse sounds. The house wasn't perfect, but it was alive. One evening, as Maria cleared the dishes, Ethan joined her in the kitchen. He leaned against the counter, uncharacteristically relaxed. "You've changed everything," he said quietly. Maria shook her head. "No, Lily changed everything. She just needed someone to believe in her." Ethan studied her face, his voice softer than she'd ever heard. "And I needed someone to remind me that control isn't love, that sometimes the bravest thing a father can do is let go." They stood in silence, the weight of his words sinking in. For Maria, it wasn't just about Lily. It was about every child, every person ever dismissed for being poor, different, or unwanted. For Ethan, it was about redemption, about realizing that wealth and power meant nothing without compassion. The real turning point came at Lily's school recital a few months later. The auditorium buzzed with parents and teachers, all expecting the usual performances. When Lily's name was called, a hush spread. Some whispered, "Isn't she the girl who never spoke? The one who couldn't walk?" Lily walked onto the stage, her little steps wobbly but determined. Maria's hands trembled as she clutched the program. Ethan sat rigid beside her, eyes locked on his daughter. Then Lily began to sing, soft at first, then stronger with each note. The room fell silent, jaws slack, eyes wide. The same people who once pitied or doubted her were now witnessing something extraordinary.
When she finished, there was a moment of stunned quiet, followed by thunderous applause. Parents stood to their feet. Some cried. Maria covered her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. Ethan, for the first time in years, let his tears fall openly, his pride unmasked. After the recital, people approached Ethan, offering congratulations, but he only pointed to Maria. She's the reason Lily found her voice. Maria flushed, but she knew the truth. It wasn't just her. It was resilience, patience, and the decision to never give up. That night, as they returned home, Lily fell asleep in Ethan's arms, her head resting peacefully on his shoulder. Maria walked beside him, her heart full. She thought of her father's words, the struggles of her family back in Brooklyn, and how far she'd come. The story wasn't about her being a maid, or Ethan being a millionaire, or even about Lily's illness. It was about something deeper. The power of love to break walls, the courage to confront prejudice, and the truth that every soul, no matter where they come from, deserves a chance to be seen, to be valued, to be loved. Maria whispered as she closed Lily's bedroom door that night. "We made it." And for the first time in a long time, Ethan replied softly, "Yes, together."
Life often places us in rooms where silence weighs heavier than words, where prejudice and fear try to strip people of their dignity. This story reminds us that real strength is not found in control, status, or wealth, but in the courage to face injustice with grace and persistence. Sometimes it takes one small act of compassion, listening when no one else will, standing tall when others expect you to shrink, to spark the kind of change that reshapes lives. We all carry scars, visible or not, and too often we hide them behind walls of pride or bitterness. But as this story shows, healing begins when we dare to open our hearts, challenge toxic patterns, and believe that every human being is worthy of respect and love. It's a quiet truth, but a powerful one. Dignity is not given by others, it is claimed by living authentically. What about you? Have you ever faced moments where you had to rise above prejudice or find strength in unexpected places? Share your reflections in the comments. I'd love to hear your thoughts. And if this story touched you, please hit like, share it with someone who might need encouragement, and subscribe for more inspiring and thought-provoking stories. May peace, hope, and the courage to keep moving forward always walk beside you.